In 1978, 18 families in China's Anhui province made a secret pact. They would divide their collective farm into individual plots. They would work independently, and each family could keep whatever profits they earned. If any of them got arrested, the others promised to care for their children.
When Deng heard about this from one of his colleagues, who was the governor of the province of Anhui where it began, he said, don't stop that. He says, let's see how it works out. And when this governor then reported that incomes were increasing and harvests were doubling, then Deng said, okay, this is the way to go. And so he made this a policy by the early 1980s, by 1982. This was the policy in the whole country. Every single commune was decollectivized.
Deng Xiaoping had a saying that had infuriated Mao. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice.
Peasants got back their own family plots, and that released this energy of the peasants to earn money. They had economic incentives, and then the villages began to set up small workshops, and they did small-scale things. Then they began to make connections with the international markets, and they would start producing shirts or socks or textile goods. So it was a gradual process.
When I first started as a freshman in college in 1978, our meals did not even have enough meat. By my second year in college, things began to change dramatically. Food became abundant, a variety of vegetables, meat became available. And I felt at that time I could see the change quite dramatically unfolding. And indeed, people knew that's because of the reform.
1984 marked the 35th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. According to the World Bank, China's economic growth had now reached 10% per year. It would remain there for more than a decade. But China was still a communist country. Beneath the rising tide of economic and personal freedom, the political system remained largely unchanged.
In the beginning, Deng Xiaoping thought he could have both economic reform and also political reform. But when the Solidarity movement developed in Poland, there was this great fear in the Chinese leadership that you would have a comparable development in China, a joining together of labor, of workers, and intellectuals. So he began to gradually clamp down.
On May 15, 1989, the Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev boarded a jetliner for Beijing. His historic visit would lay to rest a bitter 30-year struggle for leadership of the communist world. An elaborate welcoming ceremony was planned at Beijing's Great Hall of the People. But there was a problem.
Suddenly a message comes to Gorbachev or his party on the airplane saying, well, we've changed the plans. When you land, we're going to have some alternative ceremony. We're not going to the Great Hall of the People. And the reason is because that's in Tiananmen Square, and Tiananmen Square is filled with demonstrators demanding an end to communist rule in China.
By the third day of Gorbachev's visit, 1 million people occupied the square and the surrounding area. Once the Soviet leader had departed, Deng ordered his troops to clear the square.
To this day, we do not know exact numbers of people who died in the bloodshed. Some reports say there were thousands, others say hundreds. Probably true things somewhere in between.
Even though Deng had put down the movement for political reform in China, he soon ordered that economic reform resume. In 1993, the National People's Congress enshrined the term socialist market economy in the Constitution. Still, the Communist Party remained firmly in control.
Deng is a very complex figure. His stature in history will be examined, re-examined many, many times down the road. His end goal is not to dismantle the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Never was. The Chinese reform, it was able to keep stability, but it has not really fundamentally changed the political system.
Deng and Gorbachev were two reformers who set out to rescue socialism. But they were on two different paths. While Deng focused on overhauling the economy, Gorbachev turned his attention to the political system.
Gorbachev in 1987 did face a choice. He came to the point where he either had to retreat to essentially neo-Stalinism of the Brezhnev era and pray that there would be enough political stability for him to serve out his term, or he had to radicalize his approach. Nobody at the time, say early 1987, had any idea that this would lead to a revolution.
In a way, it had come full circle. Here, Lenin had revised Marx, Karl Marx, who believed that the proletariat was naturally socialistic and would make a revolution, and Lenin, who had a politics based on the absence of trust. And now Gorbachev flips and is completely the opposite from Lenin, and saying that we have to trust the people. Otherwise, we have no socialism and we have no Soviet regime.
Gorbachev now spoke often about glasnost, a word that meant openness. The Soviet people were now free to talk about subjects that had long been forbidden. The nation soon found itself awash in a flood of revelations about the crimes of Joseph Stalin. But glasnost didn't stop there.
Contrary to what Gorbachev expected, they quickly disposed with Stalinism. They started talking, they went back all the way to Lenin, who to Gorbachev at that time was an icon. And they quickly began to discover how unjust, how inequitable, how stupid economically the entire regime was. It was no longer Stalinism that was to blame. It's the entire system of one-party dictatorship based on the total ownership of economy by the state. Glasnost became it was a match, a burning match thrown in the pool of gasoline, and that all that's required was just giving it enough time to burn it.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
Under pressure from both within and without, the momentum of change accelerated.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In March 1989, the Soviet Union held the first free parliamentary elections in its history.
A lot of communist bigwigs were just sort of kicked out. And some young faces, engineers, doctors, philosophers, journalists, suddenly became MPs, members of parliament.
But 1989 had only gotten started. Poland was the first domino to fall. Solidarity, the independent trade union, had managed to survive underground through the 1980s. Faced with rising discontent, the Polish communists finally gave in to demands for parliamentary elections.
There were free elections held, but there was a trick, which was there were certain seats that were supposed to be guaranteed for the government, which the opposition was not allowed to run against. And yet, it may be the only time in history that candidates ran unopposed and still lost.
Voters simply crossed the communists' names off the ballot. Meanwhile, Solidarity had captured 99 out of 100 seats in the new Senate. All the while, Moscow stood by in silence.
The Polish events had a huge effect on the Soviet Union. To see people like us doing something completely different, just standing up and opposing, that was something people couldn't believe. We couldn't believe it was happening on our doorstep. And in this respect, the victory of Solidarity-led coalition in parliamentary elections in June 1989 was something that started the final stage of the collapse of what was called the Eastern Bloc. Next year, the Warsaw Pact was gone.
Magyar Köztársaság!
Many of the Soviet republics began to assert their independence, while Gorbachev struggled to lay the groundwork for a post-Soviet Union of sovereign states. But a group of hard-line communist aides had had enough. In August 1991, they launched a coup and placed Gorbachev under house arrest. Tanks and troops appeared on the streets of Moscow. At the time, Konstantin Eggert was a newspaper reporter in Moscow.
Well, I rushed off to my editorial office in a city newspaper, and it was this feeling of, oh yeah, we know, here they come back. We know what they're going to do. They're not going to spare anybody.
Then something remarkable happened. Hundreds of thousands of citizens poured the streets to resist. Many of the soldiers joined them.
When it really went, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Nothing happened. Just all these mighty armies, KGB, all those people held sway over the country for 70 years. They just hid. Just ran away. There was nobody to defend it. It was a system without defenders.
In the middle of it all was Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Federation. His popularity had now eclipsed Gorbachev's. After the coup collapsed, it was Yeltsin who issued a decree that effectively outlawed the Communist Party. In the following months, the Russian republics voted one by one to declare their independence. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as leader of the disintegrating Soviet Union.